In The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, a little more than halfway up Zora's River from Lake Hylia is a fishing hole, clearly inspired by the one that appeared in Ocarina of Time, but on a larger scale. Instead of just being a circular pond inside a wooden enclosure, this is a whole lake which requires a canoe and a guide to thoroughly explore it. And by the same token, the pro shop here isn't just a counter with some fish on it, it's a cabin with all kinds of stuff strewn about and hanging on the wall. This is one of my favorite virtual places in any video game because it's got a personality that just flows from every nook and cranny. You can look at a dozen different things in here, and the proprietor, Hana, will notice that you're interested and start talking to you about them. This is a really dynamic kind of storytelling that you rarely get to see, not only in other games, but also in most of Twilight Princess. One of the things in this room that you can notice is a little hand-carved wooden game called Roll Goal, which Hana leaves out as a diversion for her customers, and possibly also a way to make some money on the side. The way the game works is that you put a marble at the beginning of a twisting wooden course, and you have to tilt the box to make the marble travel all the way to the other end without falling off. If you succeed, you win 10 rupees, but it costs 5 rupees to play, and winning can be surprisingly tricky, so it's really something you do just to prove that you can. Considered as a game, Roll Goal has a lot in common with several popular standalone puzzle games, like Marble Madness and Super Monkey Ball. But if you look at it as more of a toy, it also might make you think of the real-life toy known as a marble run, in which marbles are shot through a series of channels and pipes, which can be either pre-assembled, or more interestingly, modular. But as for me, and maybe this is because it appears in the context of a video game with lots of other crazy puzzles in it, what Roll Goal brings to my mind is a specific toy that I played with as a little kid, called Screwball Scramble. Screwball Scramble is a reflex testing game, which involves getting a small metal ball across a molded plastic obstacle course so it can ring a bell on the other side. You get the ball over each of 8 obstacles by operating a set of 7 controls at the bottom, ranging from simply smacking a button, to tilting a platform around, expanding and contracting a pair of rails, balancing the ball on a swinging arm, and so on. Oh, by the way, there's only 7 controls because one of them moves 2 parts at the same time. Like Hana's fishing hole, this is something I find appealing because it's so dense with creative ideas. The game is about the size of 2 hardback books placed side by side, considerably smaller than, say, the plastic contraption that players build in the classic board game Mousetrap. Yet it features 8 distinct mini-games, each of which has its own difficulty curve and a unique way of moving the ball around. It's about as complicated as a purely physical toy can get, and I think that's pretty cool, especially when you consider that there was no virtual equivalent to draw inspiration from while it was being designed. Screwball Scramble was created in 1979 by the Japanese toy company Tomy, and its invention capped off a pair of enormously successful decades for Japan's toy makers, with the country shedding its immediate post-war legacy as a producer of cheap tin plate cars and robots, and developing a reputation for uniqueness, high-quality construction, and practically supernatural awareness of what would appeal to children all over the world. Curiously enough, one of the companies that would benefit the most from this seismic shift in the Japanese toy market was one which isn't generally thought of today as a toy maker. It's a company that didn't even make children's toys in the early 60s when this revolution began, yet its experience with toys profoundly influenced the way its products were made and marketed for at least the next 20 years. That company was Nintendo, which would go on to dominate the video game industry in a way that no single Japanese company ever managed to dominate the toy industry. And a big part of how it managed to do that was by treating video games as toys. But another secret of Nintendo's success was its knack for emulating the best ideas of its competitors, in ways ranging from small and subtle to completely blatant. Nowhere is this more obvious than in the market that Nintendo entered as a kind of bridge between toys and video games, electromechanical amusements, which Japanese firms initially imported from the United States. Then they used what they had learned to make knockoff versions that appealed more to Japanese consumers. And finally, they got to the point where their games were so good that they were the ones being copied by American companies. And that brings up another anecdote, this one not so much personal as historical. Back in the year 1965, Japan was riding a wave of international esteem and prominence that would have been unthinkable in the dark days following World War II. And no country was more eager to experience Japanese culture than its erstwhile enemy, the United States. Japanese children's shows like Astro Boy were dubbed in English and aired on American network television. A Japanese pop song had landed in the Billboard Hot 100 without even being translated, although the title was changed rather vapidly to Sukiyaki. Amateur motorcyclists raved about the accessibility and convenience of the Honda Super Cub, which became such an icon that the Beach Boys wrote a song about it, an honor previously reserved for American automobiles like the Ford Thunderbird. Most impressively of all, Tokyo had just hosted the 1964 Summer Olympics, an enormously complex and expensive 14-day-long event which involved building brand new athletic facilities and providing accommodations for more than 5,000 competitors, as well as hundreds of thousands of tourists, many of whom had never visited Japan before. This was also the first Olympics to be broadcast all over the world via satellite, reaching an audience of hundreds of millions who, for the first time, were watching the actual live event instead of a recording made hours before. One of the two most influential Japanese cultural products of 1965 was a documentary chronicling the Tokyo Olympics, full of exciting cinematography and, also for the first time, extensive coverage of the events and their participants, rather than just the results. Even today, this is considered one of director Kon Ichikawa's masterpieces, and possibly the best Olympic documentary ever created. But the other product, while more humble in appearance and less remarked on at the time, may well have been the more influential of the two in the long run. This was an electromechanical game called Torpedo Launcher, produced by the Nakamura Manufacturing Company of Tokyo, which instructed players to look through a simulated periscope to aim and fire torpedoes at a group of enemy ships, represented by cardboard cutouts which moved back and forth. The path of your torpedo was indicated by a line of colored lights. With only 5 torpedoes to fire per game, this was a thrill that didn't last very long, but it was on the cutting edge of arcade amusements, and it was very, very popular. So popular, in fact, that another amusement company quickly bought the rights to Torpedo Launcher. Whether they licensed the game or bought it outright is unclear, shrunk the original 3-player machine down to a more manageable single-player size, and released it the next year not just in Japan, but also in the US, where it appeared under the name Periscope, and offered a game for the then unheard-of but soon-to-be standard price of $0.25. Periscope was an even bigger hit than the original Torpedo Launcher had been, and it encouraged the company that released it to invest hugely in the electromechanical amusement business, which would serve as a springboard for its later success in the world of arcade video games. This was a remarkable move from a company whose original business was importing slot machines from the US to entertain GIs stationed overseas, a fact memorialized in its original name, Service Games of Japan. But by the time Periscope released in 1966, the company had already abbreviated its name to the more pithy and Japanese-sounding, if less meaningful, Sega. And what about the original creator of Torpedo Launcher, the Nakamura Manufacturing Company? Did they just leave the world of gaming behind, or go out of business? Not exactly. The reason that name isn't famous today is because the Nakamura Manufacturing Company renamed itself like Sega did, taking just a handful of letters from the 3 words of its English name to become Namco. And while Sega and Namco's business relationship may have begun with cordial cooperation, they would still compete fiercely in the coming years for a bigger slice of the arcade pizza, as it were, both between themselves and with other rivals, one of which was the Kyoto-based Nintendo. Over the next couple of videos, I'll be discussing these mid-century amusement wars, which laid the groundwork for the video gaming landscape of the 80s and 90s, and featured many of the same competitors. First, the Toy War of the 1960s, in which Nintendo first branched out from its traditional business of playing cards, and found out just how demanding Japanese kids could be, along with older and more established toy companies like Tomy, Takara, and Bandai. And then the Arcade War of the 1970s, when Nintendo abandoned traditional toys and entered the riskier but potentially more lucrative world of electromechanical games, pitting itself against the likes of Namco, Taito, and Sega, a contest which foreshadowed the eventual fight for video game dominance in which all of these companies would play a major part. But if we're going to delve this far into the past anyway, we might as well go a little further and take some time here to explain what it was that drew Nintendo into the toy business to begin with. It all begins with the turn of a card. This card, to be precise. It represents January, the month of the Japanese New Year, and features depictions of a red-crowned crane and the sun, both traditional symbols of Japan. It's one of the highest-scoring cards in a centuries-old Japanese game known as Hana Awase, or Gather Flowers, and the cards themselves are known as Hanafuda, or Flower Cards. Earlier Japanese card games had been played solely for diversion or the display of refinement, such as Hyaku ni Nishu, literally 100 people, 1 verse each, which involves identifying the last line of any one of 100 classic poems from Japanese history. But Hana Awase, which grew out of European card games introduced to Japan by Portuguese traders, was a gambling game, which gave it a seedy, undesirable reputation. Even today, most forms of gambling are banned under Japanese law, and in the 18th and 19th centuries, the government was even more restrictive. Even when it didn't ban all card games, it almost always banned Hanafuda and other Western-inspired cards. All this changed in 1885, when the Meiji Emperor, as part of his ongoing efforts to integrate Japan into the modern Western world, repealed the traditional ban on gambling. This was a reason to celebrate for many, none more so than the 26-year-old Fusajiro Yamauchi, the son of a craftsman in Kyoto who was also an avid Hanafuda player. Fusajiro had had to grow up quickly. At the age of 18, he had already inherited his prospective father-in-law's business producing and selling lime, the building material, not the fruit. Since the family he was marrying into had no male heir to carry on their name, his father-in-law had insisted on his going through a process called mukoyoshi, in which he would be legally adopted by the Yamauchi family and take their name. His original name was actually Fusajiro Fukui. Fusajiro did well for himself in the lime business, but he also realized that the rise of legal gambling in Japan provided opportunities for a clever entrepreneur. As a trained craftsman and a fan of Hanafuda, he decided to open a factory where he would produce his own handmade cards and sell them throughout Kyoto. The first deck of cards, which he designed personally, was instantly recognizable from the illustration of Napoleon which he printed on the box. By the way, if this looks familiar, you probably recognize it as one of the treasures found near the end of Pikmin 2 in the Dream Den. From there, he branched out into other related products, including the classic European 52-card deck. He was one of the first to produce Western-style cards in Japan instead of just importing them. And that was a smart move, because the imperial administration, in response to the increasing profits generated by gambling, soon decided to slap a hefty tax on card makers, which nearly doubled the price of a deck. Many companies went out of business, but Nintendo, with its unique Western-style cards, persevered. By the time Fusajiro died in 1929, Nintendo had become the largest playing card company in Japan. Like his father-in-law before him, Yamauchi didn't have a biological son to take over the business, but he had been more proactive about addressing the problem. 24 years earlier, when a Nintendo employee named Sekiryo Kaneda had married his daughter Tei, he had also insisted on mukoyoshi, officially adopting his son-in-law and changing his name to Sekiryo Yamauchi. After taking over, Sekiryo would oversee further expansion of Nintendo's playing card business and the opening up of new markets like India. But even though the 20 years of his presidency were quite eventful ones for the world as a whole, Nintendo changed very little through them. His last major act as president was to establish a subsidiary of Nintendo called Marufuku, a reference to a good luck symbol used in Nintendo's signage from the very beginning. It's literally the character for good luck, Fuku, inside a circle, Maru, and may also be a sly reference to Fusajiro Yamauchi's original surname, Fukui. Marufuku was established to specialize in the more expensive Western-style cards that both Sekiryo and his soon-to-be heir felt were Nintendo's best opportunity for expansion in the future. Who was this mysterious heir, you ask? Well, it was the man whose decisions we'll be following for the rest of this series, Hiroshi Yamauchi, Sekiryo's grandson, who, like Nintendo's original founder, would be asked to take over his family's business at a very young age. Born in 1927, Hiroshi Yamauchi never expected to run Nintendo while he was growing up. In what was quickly becoming a family tradition, his grandfather didn't have any sons to take over the business, but it was Hiroshi's father, Shikanojo Inaba, who would normally have stepped up by going through the process of mukoyoshi. But Inaba had other plans. When Hiroshi was only 5 years old, he quit Nintendo and abandoned his family, leaving his wife, Kimi, to care for their son alone. In the end, Hiroshi was largely raised by his grandparents, Sekiryo and Tei Yamauchi. Yet despite this closeness to the presidency of Nintendo, his heart really wasn't in the card business. He hoped to study law or engineering, and although his education was interrupted by the outbreak of World War II during his teenage years, he did ultimately choose to pursue a law degree at Waseda University, where he also met his future wife, Michiko. Then fate took an unexpected swerve. In 1949, at the age of 66, Sekiryo Yamauchi suffered a debilitating stroke that left him bedridden. Hiroshi returned from Tokyo to see his grandfather, who asked him to take control of Nintendo starting immediately. He was reluctant to tie himself down, but he agreed on one condition. No other member of the Yamauchi family was to work for Nintendo at the same time as him. Presumably, he wanted to avoid being countermanded and questioned by other employees. As Michael Eisner could tell you, having members of the founding family in a business, even at relatively low levels, can be a perfect recipe for a corporate insurrection. Nintendo's new president had a lot to be afraid of. He was only 22 years old, had no management experience, and was taking over a deeply conservative company that had been an institution in Kyoto for more than 50 years. It would have been easy for long-standing employees to dismiss him as a privileged prince, and to be fair, he acted like one, insisting on approving all new products personally, and firing almost everyone who aired their grievances about him and his decisions too freely. But Hiroshi Yamauchi was also a visionary who saw possibilities for expansion which hadn't existed before. Under his leadership, Nintendo released its first deck of cards branded with trademarked characters, thanks to a deal he struck with the Walt Disney Company in 1959. In the same year, he moved Nintendo to new headquarters in Kyoto, and 2 years later, he opened up a subsidiary in the Chiyoda ward of Tokyo. By 1962, Nintendo was doing so well that it began to offer shares on the Osaka and Kyoto stock markets. For the first time in its history, Nintendo was now a publicly traded corporation, and Yamauchi became its first chairman of the board. But now that Nintendo had gone public, the question of growth was more important than ever. Nintendo's previous success had come from acquiring a larger and larger share of the existing playing card market, but that market wasn't showing any signs of expanding in the near future. Quite the opposite, actually. As Japanese families grew more affluent during the 1960s, they started to favor more expensive pastimes than playing cards at home, and the always limited gambling market was glutted. In the West, commercial printers, which is essentially what Nintendo was, had responded to situations like this by offering new types of products that could be run off a printing press or lithograph, like jigsaw puzzles and board games. Nintendo did in fact start making board games, many based on Western licenses, in the 1960s, but they weren't terribly popular. While Japan did have several traditional board games, the board was usually more of a table, like the one used to play Go, rather than a printed piece of paper. After all, traditional Japanese interior design doesn't feature a lot of big multi-purpose tables that you could put a game board on. And jigsaw puzzles didn't become mainstream until the mid-1970s, when Nintendo's identity crisis had been over for years. So Nintendo was forced to range more widely, or should I say wildly, for a new hit product. Among other bizarre in retrospect schemes, the company operated a fleet of taxis in Kyoto for several months, and also tried to break into the consumer foods market with an instant rice product, inspired by Nissin's success with Cup Noodle in 1958. Nothing worked, until Hiroshi Yamauchi finally hit on a market that would really play to Nintendo's strengths, not as a manufacturer, but as a brand. Nintendo's original product was aimed at adults, and gambling adults at that. But over the past several decades, its image had gotten a lot more sanitized and child-friendly. Yamauchi had seen to that by greenlighting ventures like the Disney-branded cards. Nintendo products were now sold in toy stores, which meant that Nintendo had relationships with toy stores. It knew where they were and how to talk to the people who ran them. That's not too helpful if you're trying to sell taxi rides or instant rice, but it would be very advantageous if you were selling, say, toys? And so Nintendo rolled up its sleeves and waded into the crowded, fiercely competitive mid-century toy market. Yamauchi didn't have any experience manufacturing toys, but then again, he had run a huge company for 15 years, and when he started, he didn't have any experience doing that either. As Japanese corporate presidents go, he was still a fairly young man, and there was a lot of vinegar in him. And if this new approach was a sink-or-swim affair, well, he would just dog paddle for all he was worth. In the next video, we'll see how he made out, as well as the established Japanese toy companies that he was going toe-to-toe with, some of whom would go on to be prominent Nintendo allies, competitors, and everything in between. See you then!